We have been talking with Andrea about having her here and reading in the series for months. So we are absolutely delighted that she is here. She is the editor of When She Named Fire, an anthology of contemporary poetry by American women, and the author of 4 full-length poetry collections: Landscape with Female Figure, New and Selected Poems, 1982, 2012, Woman in the Painting, The Other Life, and House Without a Dreamer, which won a Nicholas Roerich Poetry Prize. Other honors include the D.H. Lawrence Fellowship, a Pushcart Prize for Memoir, and the Runes Poetry Award, the Ellipsis Poetry Prize, 2 poetry fellowships with the National Endowment of the Arts, and 2 from the Arkansas Arts Council. Her poems and essays have appeared in numerous anthologies, textbooks, and literary journals. She's been featured at writers' conferences and festivals throughout the United States, as well as England and France. Before moving to Portland, she was the writer-in-residence at Lyon College at Arkansas. This says for 22 years. I think you were there for 22. She lived there for 35, and she was there. She was the writer-in-residence there for 22 years. She is also an excellent teacher. I've been in one of her workshops and can vouch for that as far as her capabilities in instruction. She also has a website, which is on the invitation, so you can find out more about that at her website. Would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, Andrea Hollander? Andrea.
Tom pointed out that there was a visitor from Arkansas, and I want to start out by thanking Jean Dunaway, who was one of the first people I met back in 1977 when I moved to Arkansas. I was 6 months pregnant with my son, Brooke, and Jean was an attorney in town, and he still lives there, but he has become friendly with Portland and some of Portland's people. And the last time he was in Portland, or the only time he was in Portland before, I was in Arkansas. So now he's in Arkansas visiting and on his way to Asia to do some work. The other thing I wanted to say is the very first poetry reading I gave in Arkansas, this was 1988, was in his house. And he hasn't been to one of my poetry readings since then. So he owes me, and he had to come a long way to do it. So thank you, Jean. And thank you, Tom, and everyone else who's on the committee, and of course this wonderful audience. I know some of you, and I don't know all of you, and welcome to another night at this fabulous Pond House Milwaukie Poetry Series. Delighted and honored to be part of it. I thought what I would do, first I wanted to say that this is the new book, Landscape with Female Figure, the New and Selected Poems. And it contains 44 pages of new work and then selections from my 3 previous books. 2 of those 3 previous books are in the back. Avery can hold them up in a minute. But some of them, one of the books, The Other Life, which was my second book, my first one, House Without a Dreamer, is completely out of print. The Other Life I happen to have bought a lot of copies of. And I thought tonight, instead of charging $13 for that book, which is what the price is, if you buy this book, which is $18, you get the other one for $7. So basically half price. And also there's an essay-length memoir that I wrote that the college in Arkansas, which is actually, Tom gave it a very sexy pronunciation. He said Lyon College, but it's actually Lyon College, Lyon. Lyon College decided some years ago that the powers that be wanted to use that essay, which had won some awards, wanted to use it as the common freshman reading. So they had it published, in a chapbook form. And that usually sells for $7, but tonight it's $5. So There we are. Those are the ads in the back of the room. So I thought what I'd do, I'm going to read 15 poems tonight, and then I'm going to talk to you in between poems, and going to be time for questions afterwards. So I thought I would read 3 poems from each of the 3 previous books, and then read 6 poems from the new section. So that'll give you a flavor. I'm going to do it in that order, although that's the opposite order from the way the book is organized. The book starts with the new work and goes backwards in time. And I do tend to write mostly from my own experience, but also from my observations. So you're going to hear something about my life, or at least some portion of my life, and it'll be interesting to me, if not to you, to just see how the poems flow from chronologically, because I am going to read from back to front for your sake, so you can hear how a poet develops, this poet anyway. And I'm going to start with the poem that takes place in the room that I used as my study in the very first house my ex-husband and I built together in Arkansas. And it's a room with windows on 2 sides, but you'll hear about that in the poem. It happens to also be the final poem in the entire collection. It's called Dawn. This is the name for the moment the quiet house shifts between night and morning. I sit in my swivel chair in a room with 2 views, waiting to catch it, the very moment. Behind me, the moon moves slowly down. Before me, the sky lightens and tree sounds change from frog to bird. At first, the sun is an orange line along the housetops. Then it is a white ball, and the moon is gone. This happens so fast, I've come dawn after dawn to slow it down, to trap it. I want to know what it is, not scientifically, but with my whole body. I want to know the precise moment today became yesterday, tomorrow, today. I want to say I've gone deep enough, that I've borrowed nothing, that I've waited. But this is difficult. I need to know so urgently exactly how the woman who lies awake at night becomes the sleeper, then the dreamer, then the dream. I want to know why the words I am saying seem to be spoken by somebody else. The sun is higher than my window now and out of sight. It is still winter. I have to know what it's like, the moment that ice is not ice anymore, but isn't yet water. Well, one of the most difficult things to do as a poet, at least for me, is to get started, to write the first line on the page. And as a teacher of writing, one of the assignments that I gave for many years to my creative writing students at Lyon College was to begin or end a poem with lines from Shakespeare. I figured, okay, well, that helps. You get the best and you put it on the page, and then you go from there. So I would always do whatever assignment I gave to my students. And this next poem came from one of those assignments. But I gave myself a little more of a challenge, as you'll hear from the title. Beginning and ending with lines from Shakespeare. Whoever made us believe that all the world's a stage must have known we'd drive as slowly as the car would go, past the aftermath of the accident, one young man holding another man's head above the reddened pavement, a woman still in the passenger seat holding her shoulder, another, her hair in pink plastic curlers, pacing that brief space between the cars, her eyes crazy, her little boy in her arms, her girl trying to slow her down. Whoever made us believe must have known we would save that scene, however brief, save even the sky's cumulus relief of gray against gray against gray, that against our wills we'd take it all home and play it again when we were most alone, waiting by a telephone in a hallway, praying him home, praying that other day's images away, not wanting to see anymore the quick white bone jutting through the man's leg as he lay with his head in the other man's arms, not wanting over and over to hear that ambulance racing to save not only him. We believe we are more important than they, that this cannot really happen to us. This is a game, we insist. The next car we hear will be his pulling in. This is only a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Yeah, I'll tell you, you get started with something and you don't know where it's going to go. And when I put that first line about all the world's a stage down, I had no idea where it was going to go or where it was going to land at the end. But I knew I had to find something to end it on, and it did. Sometimes when I read this next poem, at high schools especially, I get people coming up to me and saying, "Now, which book was that in?" So I made sure it was in this book. Even though none of you is a high school student, I think you can relate to this, though. When you hear his name unexpectedly, long after you have claimed it wouldn't mean anything, you know you have found the one name you can never say, never even bear to hear, even if it is now someone else's name, a neighbor's child and his mother snapping it at him like a whip. You try to make that sound just a white sheet the wind slaps on the taut line. But you become that line, holding everything above the earth, stretched house to post and back again to house. Or you are the post, placed only to hold the laundry up, keep the lines straight. You are not the house, not a thing someone can enter. Okay, so those were the 3 poems I chose to share with you from House Without a Dreamer, the first book. And here is a sonnet, that thing that most contemporary poets don't write, but many do. And some of the people in this room do. Hunters. Dressed in their green-spotted drabs to blend in with trees. My brother and his new friends, then 19, erected their dark tents and dug a latrine, then gathered twigs from the edge of their camp and the driest leaves. And at twilight, all of them assembled, then bent their heads for a moment over their tang or their coffee or tea. And one boy sang a little prayer in the unarmed quiet. At night sometimes my brother still sings it. And even the air began to settle, except for the occasional rattle of insects, and in the nearby distance, mortar fire from Da Nang, insistent. Okay, wars change, but you know where that one came from. Wound. When you asked if I wanted to see and I said yes, you opened your robe, lifted off the gauze, and exposed a barbed wire fence cut through a field of snow. The snow wasn't white exactly, but used or forgotten, the air hardened by winter so that to breathe was to choke. And along its black length that separated into 2, your past and your future, That fence was streaked with indecipherable detritus, as though some small animal had been dragged from its life into it and died there, its clots of fur still frozen in the barb. This is your chest, I told myself, not some deserted pasture flattened by winter over what is lost or missing. I should have closed my eyes or pictured the ocean instead. 27 years after your death, I still can't turn away. I shut my eyes and see your chest stitched closed. If only poems were the only places to know such cold. Well, I didn't say ahead of time that that was the occasion of that poem wasn't my brother and the war, but my mother after a mastectomy. Difficult moment. But I didn't want to tell you that ahead of time. I'm going to read now the third poem from my second book. The second book is called The Other Life. And I, in that book, kept thinking about other ways that we live our other life. Sometimes just the mind of the person imagining something else. Sometimes through writing. Those who are writers, especially I imagine those who are fiction writers, can really make up something and be an I, and be a different gender, do anything he or she wants. But poets get it for the length of the page anyway. And then one of the things I thought about was that audiences, readers, didn't always think of the poet, or the speaker of a poem equaling the poet, him or herself. But once Robert Lowell came into our consciousness and wrote what is known as confessional poetry, we started to understand, or believe anyway, that anything that a poet wrote was also true about that poet's life. So I thought I would write a poem, which I did, in the voice of a confessional poet. And the poem is called Confessional Poet. Sometimes when I read my poems, I think only about the dinner to come, about the Chardonnay and the gaze of my host, the way he will study me across the table's white ironed cloth and tapered candle, and the way I'll consider his mouth, his lips. So I apologize, I confess. As you listen, I may be someplace else, though my voice does the work you expect, my mouth rounded over the words they express, my lips poised at the edge of my muted consonants, my suitable vowels. And though we are together in this small auditorium or lecture hall or classroom or cafe, already I have betrayed you as easily as I used to betray the congregation at church. At 16, I would open my mouth to sing all those solemn hymns to Jesus as I clocked in at the job of making my face do one thing, my mind another. I portrayed one of the earnest, my pure face invoking the presumption of sinlessness, the countenance of belief. But while I sang, I conjured the minister without his robes, sidling up behind me, pressing his non-sectarian body against mine. Oh, I was a sinner, at least in thought. The same thing according to my Catholic friends. Now I stand at a lectern and confess everything. The lies I have lived or invented, the truths I have hidden in them. I describe in detail the delicate fruits of the forbidden and all the ways I have enjoyed them, the fruits themselves and the telling, that other way to taste them again. Fellow sinners, As I mouth these words, I want you to believe I am imagining another place I've never been, another lover I will bring to life, another journey on which I could take you, another trip on which I will never otherwise go. So, that is the fun of writing, one of the fun things. I mean, really, why would you do it if you didn't have fun? Because you sit in a room all by yourself and you look at a blank page or a blank screen, all your friends are out there doing something else, and you're sitting there by yourself with a pen and too much time on your hands. So it better be fun. And it is. So the third volume is called Woman in the Painting, and it was published in 2006. And I'm going to read 3 poems from it. Here is the first one. Don't need any other introduction. Beauty Parlor. One of the regulars had cancer in those days before chemo. And even after the beautician lowered the hairdryer canister over the woman's head, she talked non-stop about the intense heat of cobalt treatments, the way her body burned in places she'd rather not name, how her skin there felt more like leather. When she paused, the beauty parlor grew strangely quiet. Only the hum of the dryers, the occasional whoosh of water at the sinks. Until she spoke again, no one looked at her. Then she droned on, but this time about her son, who'd stopped coming by. Now his wife had him wound around her little finger. I didn't understand yet. It wasn't his wife that kept the son away. I was 17 and only a guest in this world where my mother was a regular on Wednesdays. That day, she sat up front among the women's magazines. After I was done, we'd go to lunch. And in a few days, she'd tell me her own bad news. She'd say she didn't want to spoil my senior prom. But that afternoon, as the woman carried on and on and on, my mother already knew what she knew. It's interesting, my very first book, House Without a Dreamer, was really initiated. In fact, my writing life was initiated when my mother died at age 51. I was in my early 20s, and even though I'd written poems all my life for fun, mostly I would call them not really poems, but verse, metered, rhymed, didn't really go anywhere, kind of fun anyway. But when she died, and she and I were very close, I just found such a powerful human need to touch something human in language. And I was reading voraciously poetry, only poetry, for a long time, and just writing whatever I could. And it wasn't very good, but some of the poems by other people touched me so deeply and so helped me so much. And I thought, oh, this is what poetry is for. It is for the human heart to be touched by another human heart. And some of the human hearts that wrote those poems that meant something to me were already many years gone, many years dead themselves. And I thought, my goodness, you can't just write because you're moved. Oh, you can. But if you ever want anybody else to be moved by anything you have written, you'd better devote yourself to understanding how it is done. And so that began my apprenticeship to poetry and my serious devotion, almost like a religion, to studying the masterful poems of others so that I could maybe understand a little bit about how they worked and then apply some of those lessons to the things I was doing that in the beginning weren't very good and eventually got better enough to share. And here I am with my 4th book, so I guess it worked. So I've started Woman in the Painting during a time when my father had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And what's odd to me is that that was 3 books, my 3rd book. That was in the 2000s. My mother had died in 1970. And suddenly I was writing more poems about her, one of which you just heard. And it's so interesting, you really don't ever get finished with the things that obsess you. And they don't just stop because you wrote a poem about it. There'll be more poems. Okay, so here is a poem that takes place. In fact, the title of it is "In the 6th Year of My Father's Illness." I wonder if he remembers the jay that flew into the living room window that first day he introduced himself to the neighbor he'd known 40 years. It lay among the crushed pine bark we spread the previous May around the roses, where the roots were smooth and thornless. That jay so blue and too beautiful to move, my father said. And it stayed beautiful, even as the ants paraded in and out of its head, removing little bits to their underground country. Afterwards, its body lay still and still beautiful, as if death had not yet occurred to it, its feathers blue as the sky it once knew so well, that sky it mistook for the real thing. Some truths we cannot learn. Some we forget, as my father did, who yesterday introduced himself to me. Well, that book isn't completely sad, even though my mother has a section, my father has a section, and both of them in the sense of dying and dead. But there are 2 other sections in that book, and I have poems from one of those sections as well. Well, both of them, but I'm going to read you one, and it's much lighter. It's called First Love. Between 2 branches of juniper, the moon appears, white sliver in the night sky. This is to say, I haven't forgotten you, forgotten how you turned from the vestibule and never looked back, or the way I stood on the stoop, listless in the failing light, and watched as you slumped down the street, a dark figure blending into the wreckage of late afternoon, no one to anyone else. This is to say, I no longer miss you, that in fact I haven't thought of you in years, but I remember still the sound of early November leaves and the smell of them crushed beneath the tires of some car that pulled to the curb just as you disappeared. Tonight's moon will not return tomorrow. Already it climbs beyond the branches. This is to say, no matter how many others I've loved, you remain the first flicker in that night sky, singular, before my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Okay, so now I will read 6 poems from the new section of the book. So the section is called Landscape with Female Figure. And in a sense, these also tell a story, and I won't explain too much because I think the poems do speak for themselves, but I will talk to you as well. I won't just read. This one begins with the title that is also the first line of the poem. Every time her husband climbs a ladder, first the framing, then the roof beams, then the plywood, shingles, edging, roof vent, and now the gutters, she wants to pray him down. Not so he hears her and complains that builders cost money they don't have. They agreed he'd do it all himself. But sometimes she slips and says out loud, "Be careful." And he gives her the look of his that says, "I love you, but please don't tell me the obvious." Not that she hasn't saved them a few times on highways. As if it were nothing much to haul a 4x8 sheet of plywood up a 16-foot ladder and lift it over his head and slam it onto rafters, nail it in place as he squats on the roof, then goes down again for another. We take care with big things, but take small ones for granted, her father always warned. That's when accidents happen. Perhaps it's her father's voice she raises when her mouth opens against her better self. It's like that game she played as a kid, not stepping on cracks, believing a child would make a difference in a world where her mother could die of cancer, even though her father's a doctor. As if saying something now would force the gods, this time, to listen. So I did live in a house in Arkansas that my ex-husband and I built, and that poem comes from that building of the third house we built on the same piece of property, a long story that I'll tell you sometime. And then my husband and I divorced. It was a surprise to me, but those things happen. And this next poem takes place in that house right before I left. So the poems you're going to hear from here on are all written here in Portland, even though some of them don't take place in Portland. This one is called Wander. What we don't know, we don't know, so accept it. If your mother wandered when your father was stationed in France during the war before you were born, before you were even conceived, so be it. No matter what her sister told you years later after your mother died, what does this matter now? Your job, anyway, is to be the daughter, to stay open to where you are, your ear toward the glistening insects that draw your eye to the wild azaleas pushing their pale pink selves out of the limestone ledge just over the edge of the bluff where your house sits. What you don't know, you will never know. Look instead at the fluttering pink blossoms, at the lichen stuck to the limestone ledge beneath them. Look at the pale thumbprint of the moon in the pale afternoon sky. The house is nearly empty now, nearly no longer yours. Tables and chairs sold, couches and beds given away, trash dumped, books and dishes boxed and stacked for the truck that's on its way. Everything is somewhere else now, intact or scattered. It doesn't matter. More than once, your father wrote from the field hospital about the nurses. What was it like to read those letters? These insects must be honeybees, heavying with nectar, so many lifting in and out of the wild azaleas, you could almost smell their desire. Wild, like your mother's may have been, like your husband's was. But you don't know anything. You can sit on the porch of this emptying house and think whatever you think. You never apologized for your own lies. Your husband apologized too much. Even then, the moon slept on its side, its good ear deep in its pillow. Your job was to be the wife and mother, the daughter, to be whatever you are now. The moon has its own job. The house will fill again. Perhaps you are tired of watching the bees, of noticing how the petals of the azaleas strain upward to right themselves after the bees have finished with them. Tired of the questions that repeat themselves like the fat, predictable moon, and the doubt that manages, no matter what the truth is, to never run out. Well, many of you know the poet John Brehm, who lived here in the mid-90s, and then he left and moved to New York, and then went to Colorado, and then came back and lives here now, although right now he's in Denver, Colorado, teaching a class. Well, John and I, thanks to Paul Ann Peterson, were introduced to one another last year, and we found out that we lived about a 10-minute walk from one another, and we started to meet about once every week or 10 days and help one another to make a better poem out of a poem that was on its way. So he's my poetry writing partner, I suppose you could call him, my critique partner. Anyway, when I first met him, we traded books, and I was reading his first book, which is called Sea of Faith. And I really was quite taken with the book and something that he did, and so I started writing him a note, and the note turned into a poem, and the poem is what you're about to hear. Poem is called Question, and it says, For and After John Brehm. I've been reading the poems in your first book between tasks, or at the end of the day in bed in my nightshirt, sometimes tired, sometimes too awake, sometimes first thing in the morning, still in bed. Just now I read the one about clouds and wind, and the way your mind leaps out of control like my mind, like all our minds. And I admire the way you guide me through all the leaps the poem takes without holding my hand, trusting my instincts, if not my intelligence. And you do it in one sentence without punctuation until the end. I almost wrote the very end, but thought how superfluous very is, since the end is the end no matter what kind, and no adjective makes any difference, not even for emphasis. Someone is dead, not very dead. Not very pregnant or very divorced as I am right now. And I might have used very in my own head, but not out loud or in a poem. The last word in your poem is you, meaning not you, but a woman, which is what the poem's focus finally is. Though we don't reach that word for many lines, yet I'm never confused in your one-sentence poem that I'm now imitating, if only to see where it will lead if I keep it up the way I kept up my part of my marriage, even after I learned that my ex did not. He pretended to, but isn't that the way these things go? When you finally relax and think how good this is, how easy to be yourself without fuss, without complaint, and then the clouds you were so grateful for in the Arkansas glare and heat turn out to be storm clouds crouching over the Ozarks, about to devour everything in their wake like a starving lion, stalking the weakest in the herd, and along with the clouds, the train sound, that roar you were warned about without time to rush to the storm cellar, the train sound after such silence, and that wind, but no real train lifts the forest away like so many toothpicks, or rips off the roof of the carport and with it the new car. My heart felt like that and may as well have been torn out, because when that happens, you don't need it. You don't want it. You want to be somewhere where you can't feel anything, not even if it's true that if you let yourself feel, you will get to the other side. The fact that there is another side to get to is hard enough to believe. The way at the end of your poem, the clouds do what they want with you. You have no control, the way you have no control of the woman you want in your poem to stay. And she does not leave, at least not when you wrote the poem, although that was then and this is now, isn't it? And that was a hard one to read. But it was fun to write. Again, you sort of don't know where it's going when the poem, maybe there is such a thing as a muse, and the muse just takes over, and you just have to make sure that you practiced enough to keep your hand in shape, and the arthritis, you've done the exercises so that doesn't hurt. I'm going to read 2 more poems, and I think this will make sense to you also, without much explanation. Anniversary. Last night, I set the dining room table he's never seen. He's never seen this apartment or the street where I live, or me without the 35 pounds I lost after the divorce, 1 pound for each of our years together. I took out the good silver and the Wedgwood we never used. I ate by candlelight, alone. I didn't mind. I didn't miss him. The river light brightened as the moon rose. I watched that, breathed in the fruity redolence of the Chardonnay, sipped. I ate a chicken breast marinated in champagne and limes. I ate white rice and fresh green beans from my neighbor's garden. I ate alone and wanted nothing. I didn't raise my glass. I did the one chore that used to be his. I liked the sound of the rinse water as I lifted the plate from the suds, the little clink as I set it into the dish drainer, the hum of the wine glass as I wiped it dry. I know now where the mind can take you when you stand by yourself in the kitchen after a good meal. Whatever comes next will happen anyway. And finally, a poem that I've read every time that I've done a reading in Portland since I've written this poem, and it feels wrong not to read it, because in a way, and not in a way, in every way, it's a celebration of my being here in this wonderful community. In Arkansas, if I were going to want to go to a poetry reading, I had to create the poetry reading. I was the writer in residence at the college, and I was given a budget at some point, and I could bring a poet once a year. And that didn't happen right away, but eventually it did. And so once a year I got to go to a poetry reading, but I had to create the whole thing myself and make sure that all the publicity was done. Everything that Tom did for me tonight, I had to do for somebody else. So coming to Portland and finding that almost every night you can go to a poetry reading, and not just in Portland, but in Milwaukie, in Hillsborough, in Tigard, and other places that there's just such a wonderful appreciation for all of the arts, and poetry is not forgotten. So this is my love poem for Portland. It's called Overture. Portland, Oregon, February 2012. So I stepped off the streetcar and walked to the bus stop, marveling at the city around me and at the young woman I could never be, standing as if beautiful with her tattooed neck and metal studs through her nose and ears. And actually, she was beautiful, singing a familiar tune, its notes of grace filling the space between the two of us. And suddenly, too, a limping man with his cardboard "will work for food" sign, like the title of a poem and not his life. But who was he then? Because he began to hum. And the woman, teeth not yellow like his, smiling at him, reached into the breast pocket of her denim jacket while she sang, and fluttered a $5 bill toward him like some butterfly, which reminded me of my mother, who sang on the bed of her death as if song could keep her alive. Or maybe it was I who imagined this, a prayer not for the dead, but from the dying. My mother in her purple gown, singing as if death were not the name of anything, but part of an overture, her brown eyes earnest like those of the woman at the bus stop in my new city where I did not yet know who I would become, but now it seemed I was at least a singer at a bus stop, for my own voice joined in without my permission, and the three of us hovered in the mellifluous air on the darkening sidewalk as the bus came to us and lifted us together and away. Thank you. Oh, I just read the note. It says, speakers, please place your water cups and stuff in slots below and not on the mantelpiece. I put my book down right on that note, never read it. But I didn't spill anything, and the mantelpiece is dry. So if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Yes?
Your remark before your last poem reminded me of when I went to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri in the late 60s. And in our callow youth, we would have considered any poetry at all in Arkansas quite remarkable. Not that Missouri was...
But that Missouri was a little farther north. And Arkansas is considered south. And what do you think about that, Gene?
There was actually, well, Andrea didn't say when she read it, it was not just my house. I had a coffee house. I thought coffee was a stupid thing to serve at the time, too. I could have been to Starbucks. And eventually we had music, and then we got bored with music, so we started having rock and roll night, and then we had comedy night, and then we had poetry night. And it was really one of the best attended things that we had there, because people read their own poetry and they read the poetry of other people, and it was quite moving. So,
Well, and I would also say this. I would say that one wouldn't have necessarily expected a poet to come out of Arkansas, but neither would one have expected a president to come out of Arkansas. Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, I read an article by you in the Georgia Review about memoirists, and it struck me that I got some of your poems from the PSU library today.
How nice of you.
And I was really struck by the illumination, perception, a sense of history, and the self-perception that you present in your poems. And there's one in particular that I like that you didn't read, but
Shame on me.
it's the one about your father.
Is it called Living Room?
Exactly.
Well, you know what? I only didn't read that because I have read it enough times. I have a list of what I've read at every reading that I do, and I'd done 4 readings last year in the area, and I just looked and I tried to not repeat too much of what I'd done before, but that happens to be my favorite poem. So, do you want to hear that? Yes. Okay. All right. So, what is your name?
Kevin.
Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Let me find it, and I'll read it. Living Room. Living Room is actually a love poem I wrote during my father's illness, but I wrote it for my stepmother. But it really illuminates the disease, it illuminates my love for my father and my appreciation and love for my stepmother and her love for my father. Living Room. In the cave of memory, my father crawls now, his small carbide light fixed to his forehead, his knee pads so worn from the journey they're barely useful, but he adjusts them again and again. Sometimes he arches up, stands, reaches, measures himself against the wayward height of the ceiling, which in this part of the cave is at best uneven. He often hits his head. Other times, he suddenly stoops, winces, calls out a name, sometimes the pet name he had for my long-dead mother, or the name he called his own. That's when my stepmother tries to call him back. "Honey man," she says, one hand on his cheek, the other his shoulder, settling him into the one chair he sometimes stays in. There are days she discovers him curled beneath the baby grand, and she's learned to lie down with him. "I am here," she says, her body caved against this man who every day deserts her. "Bats," he says, or maybe field glasses. Perhaps he's back in France, 1944, she doesn't know. But soon he's up again on his knees, shushing her, checking his headlamp, adjusting his knee pads. And she rises to her own knees. She doesn't know what else to do. The two of them, explorers, one whose thinning pin of light leads them, making their slow way through this room named for the living. So thank you for asking for that. It's a sad disease, and I don't know which is worse: my mother's death from cancer or my father's death from Alzheimer's. They're not prize-winning diseases. Not that any of them are. Somebody else had a hand up. Tom.
Well, you talked about understanding how poems worked. We were talking about progress in your writing. Who would you say influenced you as you looked at that? Who do you think you really got into? And
I think the most important teacher, and I didn't have him as a teacher. I don't have an MFA. I'm a self-guided crazy woman. I think I've taught myself in two ways. I learned how to write, but it's unending. I'm still learning. But one way was to study the poems of others as if the great poems that to me were great. They're not necessarily famous poems. Poems that every time I would read them, I would still feel something physically, like Emily Dickinson did. I would pretend that was a magic trick performed by a master magician, and my job was to figure out the trick, because magicians do not give secrets away. You have to watch the trick over and over again. And so that was one thing I did. And the other thing is I studied the oral interpretation of literature. I actually have my graduate degree is in comparative literature and the oral interpretation of literature. I have a master's degree in that, and I also have did all the coursework for a PhD for both of those. Never wrote my dissertation, wrote books of poetry instead. So, but to answer the question, the poet that I learned the most from, but it was by reading all of his poems over his entire life of writing, was James Wright, who started out as a formalist. His first book is all poetry that's metered and rhymed, but they're magical. And then he moved away from that, and yet he never forgot that there was such a thing as form or sound or texture to the language. And so watching that career through reading his books really showed me what I could do. Not that my poems are like his poems, but I understood what he was doing.
yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Since we're
David.
talking about influences of other poets, along with dealing with your parents' body, there's some of the poems tonight were about your marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And especially 3 of the last 4 you read, had this interesting, cagey, shifty quality, ironic and funny and wounded.
Yeah.
That made me think of a poet that's new to me that I've just been reading, Anne Carson.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's knocking me out. It's wonderful poetry. I'm specifically reading The Beauty of the Husband.
Okay, I want to read that. I've read some of her other books. I used to write, for 25 years I was a book reviewer, and that also taught me something about other poets, but I didn't just write about poetry. But I reviewed one of her books for Kirkus Reviews called, I don't remember the name of it. It was a very unusual title. It took me 3 weeks to get to understand that book. She's not an easy poet for me. It's sort of prosy and kind of edgy and sometimes straight out prose, and then there would be a line of poetry. I mean, not easy stuff, but I have not read that one particular book.
It might be somewhat easier.
Okay.
I mean, it's still very, very cagey and way, way smart, but she found her way to some of the clarity that's in your poetry.
I'll have to read that one. I know about it, but I mean, after the 3 weeks, I thought, okay, I'm enough with Anne Carson.
Yeah.
But anyone else? Well, thank you so much for your kind attention and for being here all together. Enjoy the refreshments in the back.
Andrea's
yeah.
Be here. There are books.
There are books, and
She'll be here to
I will be here to
books,
sign books and talk to you as well.
answer questions.
Yes.
We have some refreshments.
Yes. Thank you so much
Please.
again.